Well, good morning, everyone. Glad you all be here today. First, I'd like to start by introducing myself and my group members. My name is Owen Broadway.
My name is Camille Quick.
My name is Matthew Cohn.
My name is Shreya Krishnan.
And today we will be presenting David Walker and his appeal to the colored citizens of the world. So the first term you need to know is what it meant to be an abolitionist in the U.S. at this time. So an abolitionist is a person who favors the eradication of any law or any practice that is deemed harmful to society. But prior to the Civil War, this term was most associated with the abolitionist slavery. So also known as the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement began in the late 18th century. In the late 1830s, this movement created big tension in America because most of the anti-slavery activism was more so in the North and more opposed in the South. So one of the early black abolitionists who revolutionized this movement was David Walker. Born in 1797 in Wilmington, North Carolina, Walker was a free black man whose father was a slave, but whose mother was free, which also meant that he was free. Walker developed a strong hatred for slavery at a young age when he witnessed a child being forced to whip his own mother to death. He declared, "If I remain in this bloody land, I will not live long. I cannot remain where I must hear slaves' chains continually and where I must encounter the insults of their hypocritical enslavers." Walker moved to Boston in 1826, where he owned a used clothing store and became an agent in the Freedom's Journal, an abolitionist newspaper, as well as a leader in the Massachusetts General Colored Association. He was influenced by early experiences of the brutality of slavery, as well as former President Thomas Jefferson, who declared that black people were inferior to white people. So in 1829, David Walker wrote and published, in its full name, an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressively to those of the United States of America. It addressed the injustices of slavery and encouraged slaves to fight for their freedom. Walker used his used clothing store to distribute copies of the appeal all throughout the nation by either sewing them into the clothing of his customers or by smuggling them in barrels that were being shipped to the South. So Walker was seen as an unsung hero to some, but why? Had there been any other racially revolutionary document prior to the appeal? And if not, what were the effects and why were they so significant? So we are going to prove that David Walker's appeal revolutionized the anti-slavery movement because it was the first widely known document to expose the hypocrisy of white Christians in America, as well as encourage slaves to violently revolt against their masters. The highlighted points are points of emphasis for our argument.
The appeal was broken into 5 parts, with a preamble and 4 articles. The purpose of the preamble was to introduce the full injustices experienced by the African Americans due to the white Europeans and white Americans. David Walker's appeal brought to light many of the other problems with slavery and the hypocritical aspects of the religion of Christianity. The first part of the appeal dealt with slavery, and he wanted to bring to light to those who may not have known, who have been shielded from it in the North, that slavery was way worse than they could have imagined. Walker believed that the African American people were the most degraded people in history, even comparing them to the Egyptians, who eventually had consequences for their actions, for their cruel mistreatment. And he also implied that eventually the white Christians would have to repent for what they had done to the African Americans. The second article of the appeal was focused on the ignorance of the older generation of slaves who had felt that their way of life would never change. They had grown into a sense of normalcy and they realized that they were just never going to change. And Walker tried to rally them through religious aspects of the Bible, saying that slavery was sacrilegious and that the white Christians would eventually have to pay for their mistreatment. And he was able to bring all of them together and start the revolution against slavery. The first and second articles were basically the build-ups for the third and fourth, bringing out a lot of the less exposed parts of slavery and trying to revolutionize the entire African American slave population and trying to get them to move towards a more freedom induced society.
So in the third article of the appeal, Walker talked about how Europeans would use Christianity as an excuse for slavery, but then he also went into how that in and of itself was a contradiction of the religion as a whole and the Bible. He talked about how Europeans tried to save the Africans by baptizing them, but then they would turn the African Americans against each other and make them fight each other so they would be ready to fight in an actual war, and then they would trade these captives of war into European slavery. Walker talked about how the Americans, or more specifically the Christians, who thought that they were so superior to the blacks would end up repenting for their actions in the future because of all the cruelty that they caused. In the fourth article of the appeal, Walker criticizes the opinions of several prominent whites who thought that they should create a colony for free African Americans. Speakers such as Henry Clay and Elias B. Caldwell talked about how whites were innocent in the hardships of blacks, which appalled Walker, and again, he goes back to Christianity, because these white people were looking at God as someone who would rightfully bless them, and they fully believed in God, but at the same time, here they were going against God and everything that he stood for by causing all of this suffering to others. Walker also talked about the fact that black people needed to rise up and they needed to fight against the white people, and they needed to take revenge for everything that was being done to them. And he actually kind of put the blame on the African Americans as well, because he said that they've been staying there and being pushed around rather than realizing what was happening and fighting. But at the same time, he said this was okay and they still had an opportunity for redemption as long as they rose up at this point to fight against the white people. So in the third and fourth articles, Walker portrayed to his audience much more clearly as to why African Americans had been oppressed for so long and why they've been unable to escape from it. And he talked about how the brutality of slavery and, essentially the brutality of slavery that the white people were causing was something that people really weren't exposed to. And so he exposed the audience actually to how the African Americans had essentially been brainwashed by the white people into thinking other beliefs were true, and that, like, for example, slavery was okay in the Bible and slavery was okay with Christianity, when in reality that wasn't the truth. So he hoped through his appeal, he urged African Americans to fight back and take revenge for everything that had been done to them, both mentally through believing the truth and not the lies that they've been fed for all this time, as well as physically through actual rebellion.
Okay, so now the aftermath, basically the real life effects of the appeal. So the appeal was described as a star in the sky, basically led slaves towards the north or freedom and emancipation, which basically, the star in the sky metaphor is actually used a lot in like the black community. It's used in the Underground Railroad, basically saying that the star in the sky will lead you to freedom, basically. The appeal, one of the reasons it was so powerful in the community is because it was written by a black man. The slaves could really just, they understand that, like, they know the same thing as him. Like, he really feels their struggle. And the appeal also brought up many great points why the slaves should be freed. One was actually a quote from the appeal I will read to you. They want us for their slaves and think nothing of murdering us. Therefore, if there is any attempt made by us, kill or be killed. And believe this, that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty. Basically, this is trying to understand that the blacks have just as many rights as the whites. Because if the whites are trying to kill them, they should be just equally, they should have an equal shot to kill the whites because they're going for them. Everyone's equal. And also, black America is greater than white America. What this means is the black America, or the slaves, have put in so much more physical work in making America what it is today, while the white Americans just kind of sit back and just watch their slaves do all the work. So the appeal slowly made its way around the United States around 1830 when it was first published, and encouraged slaves to use violence as a vehicle to earn their way back to their freedom. So basically, do anything you can to go back to the North, anything you can to be free. And this caused a lot of paranoia with the slave owners, especially in Georgia and most southern states, Deep South. The appeal was even outlawed in Georgia, and in some states there was a bounty on Walker's life. When the third and final version of the appeal came out, it was well known pretty much everywhere. Like, slaves knew about it, white owners knew about it, everyone just kind of like kept it in the back of their mind. And one of the reasons, the appeal inspired one of the most famous abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, and he actually kind of followed in his footsteps, writing something. He wrote The Liberator, a famous weekly news article that talked about like the emancipation of slaves, and it talked about the appeal in pretty much every edition. Finally, the appeal continued to affect the United States even after the Emancipation Proclamation. Basically, a bunch of famous abolitionists followed in David Walker's footsteps, from Martin Luther King to W.E.B. Du Bois to Malcolm X. They all kind of just followed in his footsteps and like read the appeal. They kind of knew about it. And also slave revolts during the Civil War. This can be traced back to the appeal, plus like the lessening of troops in the South because there was a war. Just all that coming to them just made them really feel like they can revolt and like overthrow the slave holders, basically.
So for some more like general effects of the appeal, it, as we mentioned earlier, increased Southern white paranoia that rebellions would happen, and this led to increased restrictions on blacks as a whole. And because of Walker's huge emphasis on God and the Bible throughout the entirety of the appeal, black preachers were also looked at a lot more closely. And so some examples of these restrictions were that slaves were prohibited to be educated. They were also prohibited from religiously gathering. And also free blacks also had restrictions on them because slave owners felt that in a way they could taint the minds of slaves. And there's no concrete proof that the appeal led to Nat Turner's rebellion, but it did happen right after the appeal was released. And both the appeal and Nat Turner's rebellion led to increased restrictions on blacks as well as paranoia in white slave owners. And there was also an increase in anti-abolitionist sentiment because white people believed, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion, that abolitionists were the root cause of slavery and all these rebellions that were happening. And so they were trying to put a stop to that. And actually, to prevent the dissemination of the appeal for its spreading throughout the country, for just a first offense, blacks were whipped, imprisoned, and even killed, and there were more brutal punishments for further offenses. Overall, the appeal kind of served to promote a sense of pride and hope for future generations that if black people rose up and if they did fight now, then future generations would be emancipated. So in conclusion, Walker's appeal essentially began a movement of black nationalism throughout the entire country because it was one of the first documents to explicitly talk about how horrible slavery was. Because up until that point, documents had talked about slavery and what happened, but they never really explicitly stated it. They kind of sugarcoated it in a sense. So Walker's appeal was the first thing to very explicitly state it and show people this is actually what's happening. It was also one of the first documents to outwardly talk about white people and Christianity and how they use that as an excuse for slavery, because no one had really gone out and said that to people. They might have thought it up until that point, but no one really went out and talked about these white people because they seemed so superior to black people. So Walker released 3 editions of the appeal, and shortly after his 3rd edition, he mysteriously died, so he was unable to experience the effects of his work. But his son, Edward Garrison Walker, continued David Walker's legacy when he became the first black man to be elected to public office in Boston when he was elected to the Massachusetts legislature in 1866.
Okay, guys, we're going to hold our questions until the second group is gone. So if you guys want to shut off your recording and the next group will start getting set up, and we'll take a minute to let that